The city was already wide awake when Lucas Bennett stepped out of his cramped two-bedroom apartment in the lower end of Brook Hill District. The sky was blanketed in a dull gray, hinting at the rain it would soon release. Clutching a torn umbrella in one hand and his daughter's tiny fingers in the other, Lucas hurried along the cracked sidewalk, his boots splashing against the puddles from the night before. His daughter, Lily, 6 years old and just starting first grade, skipped beside him in her polka-dotted raincoat, humming a tune that Lucas barely recognized. "Are we late again, Daddy?" she asked, tilting her head back to peer at him through the rain-speckled rim of her hood. Lucas smiled down at her, exhaustion etched deep in the corners of his eyes. "Not if we fly," he replied, making exaggerated airplane noises as they ran the last few feet toward the school gates. The humor lightened the weight on his shoulders for a moment. Once Lily was safely inside, he glanced at the time. 8:06 m. If he didn't catch the 80:15 bus, he'd be late for his shift at Calhoun's auto garage. His boss, Greg, wasn't the forgiving kind. Especially not for someone like Lucas who worked part-time, covered late shifts, and occasionally brought his daughter along when no sitter could be found. The rain began to fall harder now, soaking the hem of his jeans. He broke into a jog, weaving between pedestrians who barely noticed him. That was life in the city. Too fast, too self-contained, too indifferent. You could fall on the sidewalk, and 10 people would step over you before one might ask if you were okay. And it was right then, amid the blur of umbrellas and hurried feet, that he noticed her. An elderly woman stood at the edge of a narrow sidewalk near Elmwood Square, frozen beneath a flickering street lamp. She wore a deep plum coat, velvet with silver buttons, out of place against the grimy backdrop of fast food wrappers and busted fire hydrants. Her thin white hair was swept into an elegant bun that was unraveling in the wind, and her leather handbag, worn but expensive, hung limply from her hand. She looked lost, and more than that, she looked invisible. People passed her by, businessmen in long coats, teenagers glued to their phones, even a patrol officer. No one so much as glanced at her. No one noticed how she turned slowly in place, blinking at street signs as though trying to read a foreign language. Her lips trembled not just from the cold but from some deeper, private disorientation. Lucas slowed to a stop. He stood under the awning of a closed pharmacy, watching her. A small voice inside reminded him of the clock. 8 minutes until the bus. He'd be late again. Greg would yell again. The rent was already overdue, but he couldn't walk away. He stepped toward her, ignoring the rain soaking into his hoodie. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman flinched as though she hadn't heard another human voice in hours. She turned to him with glassy, storm-gray eyes and looked directly at his face, her lower lip quivering. "I don't know where I am," she whispered. Lucas felt something twist in his gut. "You're near Elmwood and 3rd. Do you live around here?" She blinked, and a tear ran down her cheek. "I don't remember. That did it." "Okay," he said gently. "You're cold. Let's get you out of the rain. There's a diner just down the block." She hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she looked past him to the rushing people, the honking cabs, the relentless downpour. Slowly, she reached out, and he took her hand. It was icy. The two of them walked in silence. Lucas guided her with care, instinctively shielding her from puddles and people as though she were a relative. The bell above Daisy's diner jingled as they entered. The warm air smelled of coffee and frying bacon. The waitress, Daisy herself, raised an eyebrow but said nothing as Lucas led the woman to a booth near the window. They sat. Lucas asked the waitress for 2 cups of tea and some dry towels. He draped one over the woman's shoulders and handed her the steaming mug when it arrived. "What's your name?" he asked after a long moment. "Margaret," she said softly. "Just Margaret." He waited, but she didn't offer anything more. "Okay, Margaret." "I'm Lucas." She nodded faintly, her hands wrapped tightly around the tea like it was the only anchor holding her to reality. Lucas debated calling the police or taking her to a hospital, but she looked so frightened, so fragile. If he mentioned either of those, she might bolt. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No, just confused." "Do you have any family we can call?" Margaret opened her handbag slowly. Inside were a few tissues, a compact mirror, a silver pen, and a wallet. She pulled out a card. Lucas leaned over and saw a library membership dated almost 20 years ago. The address was smudged, and the name read only, M.W. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's like there's fog. I remember some things, but not where I belong." Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. This wasn't what he planned for the morning. He had to work. He had bills to pay, and yet he thought of Lily. What if one day she ended up like this, alone, lost, with no one willing to stop? "Do you have anywhere to go?" he asked softly. "Noob." He sipped his tea and stared at the rain trailing down the glass. "Well then," he said after a long silence, "you'll stay with me until we figure this out." Margaret looked up sharply. "You don't even know me." "No. But I know you need help." "That's enough." By evening, Lucas had missed his shift entirely and already gotten a voicemail from Greg. "Don't bother coming back if you're not going to take the job seriously." Lucas deleted it and didn't let the bitterness show when Lily ran to him at the door. "Daddy!" she squealed. Then her eyes widened at the figure standing behind him. "Who's that?" "This is Miss Margaret. She's staying with us for a little while." Margaret offered a smile. "Hello, Lily. Your father's told me so much about you." Lily looked from her dad to Margaret and then back again. "Can she have my room?" "No, baby." Lucas chuckled. "You can share mine tonight. Miss Margaret can stay in the guest room." With the guest room was really just a glorified storage space with an inflatable mattress and a lamp missing a shade. But Margaret didn't complain. She sat on the mattress, still clutching her handbag like a life preserver, and nodded politely as Lucas offered her a change of clothes. His late wife's bathrobe and slippers, neatly folded and stored in a box he'd never dared to touch until now. Later that night, as the rain battered the windows and the radiator hissed to life, Lucas sat on the couch, staring at the TV playing a muted sitcom. What was he doing? He had a stranger in his home. An elderly woman who couldn't remember her last name, let alone where she lived. It was dangerous. Reckless, even. But when he thought of the way her eyes had filled with tears, when he spoke gently to her, when he offered his hand, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. From the hallway, he heard Margaret softly humming. The tune was old, something that sounded like a lullaby from a forgotten era. Lucas leaned back and closed his eyes. The next few days passed like something out of a dream. Margaret wasn't just passive. She was surprisingly graceful in how she integrated into their lives. She read books to Lily, helped fold laundry, and even made soup using whatever ingredients Lucas had in his kitchen. Her memory, while still scattered, seemed to improve slightly each day. She spoke of childhood summers in Vermont, her favorite color, emerald green, and a husband she once adored but wouldn't name. Lucas tried once more to get help, calling social services explaining her case. But without a full name ID or relative's number, there wasn't much they could do. He was told to bring her to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation. But when he mentioned that option to Margaret, she trembled. "I was in one of those places once," she said. "They locked the doors. I don't want to go back." Lucas dropped it. Instead, he called in every favor he had left. Odd jobs, weekend shifts, food pantry donations. The money was tight but manageable. What mattered more was that their home, for the first time since his wife's passing, felt full, alive. Lily adored Margaret. "She knows all the fairy tales," she whispered one night, "even ones I've never heard." And Lucas, he found himself looking forward to their quiet talks after Lily fell asleep. Margaret had a sharp wit beneath the fog. She spoke about art, philosophy, music. She guessed his thoughts before he said them, and once, while he sat fixing a broken lamp, she said, "You carry a weight that doesn't belong to you." He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded. One evening, as he stood on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret stepped out beside him. "You know," she said softly, "I've been invisible for a long time." Lucas glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Old women are like wallpaper in this world. People forget we're there. Until we die, and then suddenly they remember the inheritance. Lucas didn't know what to say. He offered a weak smile. "You're not invisible here." She turned to him, her eyes clearer than he'd ever seen. "I know. That's why I stayed." The days that followed Margaret's arrival at Lucas's apartment slipped by like the gentle turn of pages in a cherished book. Each sunrise brought with it new pieces of a puzzle, a deepening connection, and an unexpected sense of calm that Lucas hadn't known in years. Though their world remained modest and barely afloat, it seemed warmer now, more vibrant, like Margaret had brought with her the breath of forgotten memories and the fragrance of a life richer than the one Lucas had resigned himself to. Lucas had been a man of routine. Wake up early, get Lily ready, drop her at school, work a double shift if possible, pick her up, make a simple dinner, and collapse by midnight. But now that Margaret was in their lives, something shifted. There was a presence in the home, a steadiness that anchored the chaos. It was more than just her physical help. It was the aura she exuded, calm, graceful, and full of quiet wisdom that settled over their apartment like sunlight. Margaret, despite her initial disorientation, began to grow stronger in spirit. The fog in her eyes would sometimes lift, and bits of her old self would emerge. She laughed more. She read aloud to Lily every night, introducing her to stories that spanned generations. Her voice was melodic, refined, and sometimes oddly regal, soothing Lily into dreams with tales of forgotten kingdoms, wise queens, and brave hearts. And when Lily was asleep, Margaret would sit with Lucas on the tiny balcony that overlooked the alley and talk about things that didn't feel like small talk. She never spoke of where she had come from or who she was. Lucas tried once, gently, over cups of warm cider. "Do you remember anything new about where you lived before?" he asked, as casually as he could manage. Margaret paused, looking into her cup as if the liquid might hold secrets. "Just pieces," she murmured. "A house with large windows. A dog, maybe. A man in a gray suit. But the memories feel like they belong to someone else." Lucas nodded, letting it go. He wasn't one to force people into sharing things they weren't ready to. He knew all too well that grief, confusion, and memory had their own timelines. He had lived that truth after Emily, his late wife, passed from cancer 3 years ago. Sometimes the pain wasn't in the forgetting. It was in the remembering. Still, a question gnawed at the back of his mind. There was something about Margaret. Her poise, the way she spoke with a rare elegance, her taste in food and art, her aversion to media or anything loud or crass. She didn't fit the mold of someone who had lived in a place like Brook Hill. She moved with quiet dignity, always setting the table, even when dinner was just spaghetti, folding towels in perfect thirds, wearing a pearl pendant on a thin gold chain that seemed older than the city itself. Lucas had once asked about the pendant. Margaret had simply smiled and said, "It was a gift from a man who loved me dearly. That's all that matters." Lucas didn't press further. The turning point came one crisp Thursday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after Margaret had entered their lives. Lucas had just returned from a short landscaping job he'd picked up through a neighbor. His hands were calloused, dirt under his nails, his knees sore from squatting in gardens that didn't belong to him. But when he walked through the door, he froze at the sound of laughter. Genuine, unrestrained laughter. From the kitchen came the sound of music. Old jazz, if he wasn't mistaken. Lily and Margaret were dancing. Not gracefully, but playfully, spinning each other around in slow, stumbling circles. Flour dusted the air like confetti, and a mixing bowl sat lopsided on the counter, half filled with cookie dough. The apartment smelled of vanilla and cinnamon.
"Daddy!"
Lily squealed, running toward him, her cheeks pink with joy. "We're making cookies!" "Real ones, not from a box." Lucas grinned, surprised. "You two look like trouble." Margaret turned, and her smile was radiant, far brighter than any he'd seen on her face until now. "I taught Lily my old family recipe," she said. Wiping her hands on an apron had belonged to Emily. Lucas had forgotten it was even still in the drawer. He stepped inside, brushing the cold from his jacket. For the first time in ages, his home felt like it had a pulse. Music, laughter, warmth. And it wasn't chaos. It was beautiful. As they sat that night enjoying the cookies with warm milk, Margaret shared more than she had before. "I used to bake with my son," she said quietly, her eyes a little misty. "He was a serious boy, always frowning, until the smell of cookies filled the house, and then, like magic, he would smile." Lucas leaned in. "You have a son." "I had a son," she said, her voice distant. "But he stopped smiling a long time ago. Maybe he stopped looking for me too." Lucas exchanged a glance with Lily, who frowned in confusion. "I'm sure he's worried about you," Lucas said gently. Margaret looked out the window. "If he is, he's hiding it very well." Lucas didn't push further. Instead, he poured her another cup of tea and changed the subject to Lily's art project for school. That night, after Lily was asleep, Lucas sat alone in the living room, flipping through his old laptop. Something inside urged him to dig deeper. He typed in "missing elderly woman Margaret M." and scanned through countless listings. Nothing matched. He tried again, "Margaret lost elderly woman New York." Again, nothing concrete. Just scattered reports of elderly patients in care homes, some with dementia, others wandering, but none fitting Margaret's regal manner and distinct presence. He closed the laptop and stared at the pendant she had worn again that day. Gold, polished, with tiny inscriptions that looked almost antique. There was more to her, that much he was certain of. A few days later, Margaret asked Lucas if she could come with him to pick Lily up from school. He hesitated, not because he didn't want her to. She was part of their lives now, but because he worried how people might react. He already stood out as the young, single father at school events, often showing up in work boots and oil-stained shirts, while the other parents dressed in tailored coats and clutched coffee cups from trendy cafes. But Margaret insisted. She wore a coat Lucas had picked up from a thrift store, a navy wool one with brass buttons, and a floral scarf around her neck. Though aged, she looked dignified, her posture tall and graceful as they walked. At the school gate, several parents gave them curious looks. Some stared openly. Others pretended not to. Lucas shifted awkwardly. "Don't mind them," he whispered. But Margaret didn't seem to notice. She watched the children pouring out of the building with a soft smile on her lips, her eyes fixed on Lily as she ran forward, her backpack bouncing behind her. "Hi, Miss Margaret," Lily cried. Margaret opened her arms, and Lily embraced her like a granddaughter would a beloved grandparent. That was the moment Lucas noticed a man across the street, leaning against a black car. He wore sunglasses and held a phone to his ear, but his eyes were fixed on them. Lucas's instincts flared. The man looked out of place, like he belonged more to a corporate boardroom than a public school sidewalk, and something in his gaze unnerved him. The man made a note on his phone and got into the car, disappearing into traffic. Lucas shook off the unease. Maybe he was imagining things. He'd been living on the edge for too long, his mind always expecting the worst. That night, Lucas brought it up to Margaret. "Have you noticed anyone watching you since you've been here?" She looked up from her knitting, something she had taken up again with remarkable skill. "Watching me?" "Yeah, maybe following you?" Margaret's brows furrowed. "No. But I don't exactly go anywhere, do I?" Lucas hesitated, then shrugged. Probably nothing. But he couldn't shake the feeling. Later that week, Lucas took Lily to the park while Margaret stayed behind to rest. When he returned, he found her sitting on the couch, her handbag open on her lap, staring at something in her hand. It was a black credit card, thick, gleaming, and engraved with the initials M.W. Lucas's breath caught. Margaret looked up at him with wide eyes. "I found it in the lining of my bag. I didn't even know it was there." Lucas sat beside her. "M.W. Is that your last name?" "I suppose it must be." She traced the initials. "Winslow. Margaret Winslow. It sounds familiar. Does that mean something to you?" Lucas's mind raced. Winslow. He had heard the name before. Somewhere on the news, maybe. Business, real estate, philanthropy. He opened his laptop again and typed Margaret Winslow into the search bar. Dozens of articles popped up. Billionaire philanthropist. Harris, founder of the Winslow Foundation, known for her low media profile elegance and rare public appearances. Lucas stared at the images. There, In a photo from 5 years ago was Margaret, his Margaret, wearing the same pendant. His heart pounded. He turned the screen toward her. Margaret gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. That's me. Lucas could barely breathe. You're Margaret Winslow. Billionaire Margaret Winslow. She looked like she might faint. I don't remember any of this, she whispered. I don't remember being her. Lucas closed the laptop gently and reached for her hand. It doesn't matter. You're still you. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. But who am I to you, Lucas? A stranger. A burden. He squeezed her hand. Your family. They sat in silence for a long while, the air heavy with revelation and wonder. Outside, the city continued to bustle, unaware of the miracle unfolding in apartment 6B. A man who had nothing offering everything to a woman who had once had it all, and had now remembered who she was. But even more than that, she had remembered where she belonged. Lucas didn't sleep that night. Not really. The apartment was quiet. Lily tucked away in her bed, Margaret resting behind the closed door of the spare room. But his mind churned in relentless motion. Margaret Winslow. That name, now confirmed, wasn't just a random coincidence or shared moniker. It belonged to the woman living in his home, the same woman who had sat on his couch in borrowed clothes, who braided Lily's hair in the morning, who sang lullabies in a voice touched by time. He couldn't reconcile the two versions. One a lost old woman in the rain, the other a headline billionaire. Yet both existed in the same person. He kept turning over the laptop, pulling up articles, interviews, and board announcements. Everything he found painted Margaret Winslow as a fiercely intelligent businesswoman with a passion for philanthropy, known for her discreet lifestyle and firm grip on the family empire, Winslow Enterprises. There hadn't been any recent news, which explained why her disappearance hadn't triggered alarms across the media. But there it was 3 months ago, a brief press release. Margaret Winslow steps down temporarily from public appearances due to health concerns. No details, just vague implications. Lucas leaned back on the couch and stared at the ceiling. Why had no one come looking for her? Why hadn't her family or security or the press turned the city upside down? The next morning, Lucas moved through the apartment as if nothing had changed. He cooked breakfast, oatmeal and eggs, and watched Margaret stir honey into her tea with the same grace she always did. But something was different in her too. Did you sleep okay? He asked as she joined him at the table. I dreamed of an art gallery, she murmured. Paintings I knew the names of. I walked the hallways alone, and no one recognized me. Lucas didn't press her for more. Instead, he turned to Lily, who was enthusiastically describing a school field trip to the zoo. But after Lily left for school, Margaret remained seated, her tea untouched. Her fingers tapped a rhythm against the ceramic mug. I remember more now, she said quietly. I remember the ocean house. I remember my late husband's name, Charles. I remember board meetings and charity luncheons and the loneliness of people pretending to like me because of my wealth. Lucas sat across from her, listening without judgment. I left, Lucas, she said, her eyes narrowing on a distant point. Not because I was confused. Not at first. I left because I wanted to disappear. I felt forgotten, despite everything I gave. And as I wandered, the memories began to scatter like dry leaves. Then I got lost. You could have ended up anywhere, he whispered. You could have died out there. She met his gaze with unshakable calm. But I didn't. I ended up here. With you. Lucas's chest tightened. There was something deeply humbling about the way she said it. Not as gratitude, but as recognition. As if the universe had led her to the one place where she would be seen not as a name or asset, but as a person. Still, the situation had grown bigger than him. You need to go back, he said carefully. People will be worried. You have a son, right? You mentioned him. Her eyes dimmed. Robert. Yes, he's complicated. We drifted after Charles passed. He took over the company. Grew more focused on image, power keeping our empire running. I became a figurehead. We hardly spoke except through lawyers and assistants. Lucas frowned. But he still deserves to know you're alive. Margaret nodded. He does. Later that day, Margaret retrieved her handbag and handed Lucas the black credit card she had rediscovered. It had the Winslow family crest engraved subtly on the surface. "There's a number on the back. A private line," she said. "Use it." Lucas stared at the card for a long time before dialing the number. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and clipped with well-trained efficiency. "Winslow Holdings private line. Hello. I am calling on behalf of Margaret Winslow. She's safe. She's with me." The line went quiet. "Where are you?" the voice asked, barely concealing urgency. "She doesn't want to be rushed. She wants to speak to her son, Robert." A pause. "Please hold." The hold music was classical. Back, he thought, and ran for only seconds before another voice came on. Male, mid-40s, authoritative. "This is Robert Winslow. Who am I speaking to?" Lucas introduced himself and explained, carefully, how he had found Margaret. He left out the more personal details, opting instead for the essential facts. Robert listened in silence, until finally asking, "Can I speak to her now?" Lucas hesitated. "I'll ask her." He handed the phone to Margaret, who had been watching the entire exchange with composed silence. "Hello, Robert," she said, and her voice suddenly transformed into one of commanding poise. There was a long pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Yes, it's me. No, I'm not hurt. No, I'm not coming back today. I'm safe. That's all you need to know for now." Another pause. "Send someone to meet us tomorrow. No press. No questions. You'll get the address later." She ended the call, returned the phone to Lucas, and sighed. "I've stirred a hornet's nest." Lucas sat down beside her. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I am ready." The next day arrived cloaked in tension. Lucas spent the morning deep cleaning the apartment, as if preparing for an inspection. Lily was told vaguely that Miss Margaret's son would be coming to visit, and she seemed pleased. "Is he nice?" she asked, drawing a picture for Margaret with colored pencils. Margaret hesitated before saying, "He used to be. We'll see." At precisely noon, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Two men in suits stepped out. One was younger, clean-shaven, with a Bluetooth earpiece. The other was older, with gray hair slicked back and a face that bore the unmistakable strain of power. Margaret stood at the door, dressed in the same navy coat, but today she had added a brook of pearl and sapphire to her lapel. "Lucas," she said softly, "would you mind waiting with Lily?" He nodded, but remained close by. The moment the older man saw her, his face contorted into something between relief and guilt. He stepped forward, arms out, but she held up a hand. "Not here, Robert. We talk inside." Privately. Robert nodded, deferring. Margaret led him into the apartment, and Lucas turned his attention to Lily, who was playing quietly on the carpet with her stuffed animals. Inside the living room, Robert's voice carried, low, urgent, barely restrained. "I thought you were dead, Mother. I thought someone had taken you. You thought I was a problem." Margaret replied, steel in her voice. "You wanted me in a care facility. Quiet. Out of sight. That's not true." "It is. And maybe I would have gone if you'd asked me instead of telling your lawyers to draw up the papers." Robert fell silent. Lucas couldn't hear every word, but he didn't need to. He knew that kind of silence. It was the sound of walls falling. After nearly 30 minutes, the door opened and Robert stepped out, glancing at Lucas with a complex expression, part gratitude, part calculation. "Thank you," he said simply. Lucas nodded. Then Margaret emerged, her posture unchanged, but her eyes shimmering. "I'm going with him," she said. Lily ran forward, hugging her legs. "Do you have to?" Margaret kneeled, tears finally breaking free. "Just for a little while, sweetheart. But I'll see you again soon." Lucas stood behind his daughter. "Take care of yourself." She turned to him, took his hand, and squeezed it tightly. "You gave me back my life, Lucas. I won't forget it." Then, without fanfare, she stepped into the car and drove away. And just like that, she was gone. The days following Margaret's departure felt hollow. The apartment, while still bustling with Lily's presence, felt stripped of something essential. Lucas tried to return to his normal rhythm, but his heart wasn't in it. Work was scarce, Bills kept coming, and nights grew long. He'd never thought of Margaret as a solution to his problems, yet now that she was gone, the absence was sharp, like a candle extinguished in a dark room. Lily missed her too. She kept Margaret's scarf draped over her desk chair, sometimes falling asleep with it beside her pillow. "I miss her stories," she whispered one night. "Me too," Lucas replied. A week passed. Then one rainy afternoon, a knock came at the door. Lucas opened it to find a different man in a suit, one younger, holding an envelope. "Delivery for Mr. Lucas Bennett," he said. "From Ms. Winslow." Lucas signed the tablet and took the envelope. His hands trembling, he opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, handwritten in flowing cursive, along with a set of keys and a property deed. "Dear Lucas, some debts cannot be repaid with words, but I'll try anyway. You saw me when no one else did. You offered kindness with no agenda, care without expectation. You reminded me that worth isn't measured in dollars or titles, but in the grace of how we treat each other. Enclosed are the keys to a home I purchased in your name. It's not a palace, but it's yours and Lily's. No more rent, no more notices, just space to breathe. Additionally, a trust fund has been set up for Lily's education. She is a light in this world, and I want her to shine brightly, unburdened. Lastly, I would like you to consider a role at the Winslow Foundation. We need people like you, people who understand humanity at its roots. The offer stands, whether now or later, with all my love and gratitude." Margaret Winslow. Lucas sat on the couch for a long time, the letter pressed to his chest. The keys dangled from his fingers, still cool to the touch. Across the room, Lily looked up from her coloring book. "Was that from Miss Margaret?" she asked. Lucas nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yeah, baby. It was from her. Is she coming back?" He smiled. "Not today, but she's still with us. In every way that counts." Outside, the rain stopped. Light pierced the clouds, casting a golden hue over the windowsill where Margaret's brooch still rested, left behind, perhaps on purpose. And just like that, the world felt whole again. Spring arrived gently in Brookhill, brushing away the remnants of winter with golden sunlight and warm breezes that smelled of blooming cherry blossoms and freshly cut grass. For Lucas Bennett, the season didn't just mark a change in weather. It marked a transformation he had never anticipated, a life that had quietly shifted from mere survival to something more profound: purpose, stability, and healing. The house Margaret had gifted him stood on the quiet edge of Silverbrook, a small suburban neighborhood miles away from the cracked sidewalks and loud traffic of Brookhill. It wasn't a mansion or anything extravagant, but to Lucas and Lily, it felt like a palace. A modest, two-story home with a white picket fence, a garden blooming with marigolds and roses, and 3 bedrooms, each lit by tall windows that opened to the sky. It had a porch swing where Lily often sat with her sketchpad and a kitchen big enough for dancing while cooking. Best of all, it was theirs. Lucas had tried, at first, to refuse the deed. He didn't want charity, didn't want to feel like he owed anyone, even someone as dear as Margaret. But she had anticipated this. Her letter had made that clear. "You gave me what no one else did, unconditional kindness. This is not a payment, Lucas. It's a gesture. Let yourself receive." And so he did. The transition took time, moving their belongings. What little they had, from the tiny apartment, was a bittersweet process. Each item carried memories: the stained coffee mug Emily had once used, the squeaky tricycle Lily had long outgrown, the framed photo of all 3 of them before the sickness came. Lucas packed everything with care, uncertain at first if it was truly okay to let go of the old life. But when he placed that photo on the mantel of their new home, and Lily ran through the halls barefoot, laughing with delight, he realized that they weren't erasing the past. They were honoring it by building something stronger. The Winslow Foundation position came shortly after. Lucas had hesitated at first. He wasn't a college graduate. He had no formal education in philanthropy or management. But when he arrived at the foundation headquarters, an elegant 5-story building in Midtown lined with glass, light, and soft wood panels, he was welcomed not with skepticism but with genuine interest. He was offered a role as community outreach director, a position newly designed by Margaret herself. The job involved leading initiatives focused on single parents, families in poverty, and survivors of loss. Exactly the world Lucas knew intimately. He accepted it with both hands and a grateful heart. His new life took adjusting. The office came with suits, meetings, and polished vocabulary. Lucas, a man who had lived in overalls in Greece for years, often felt out of place at first. But he learned, fast, and what he didn't know, he made up for in grit, empathy, and authenticity. He spoke to the people he served not as a figure behind a desk, but as someone who had once stood exactly where they were. That made all the difference. And Margaret, she remained ever present, though she returned to her penthouse in the Upper East Side and resumed her role in the Winslow family. She kept her promise to stay close. Every Sunday, she visited Lucas and Lily. Sometimes she came alone, sometimes with a driver, but always with something thoughtful: a book for Lily, fresh lavender for the garden, a recipe she wanted to try together. To Lily, she was more than a benefactor. She had become Grand Maggie, a title that stuck after a sleepy afternoon when Lily slipped and called her that. Margaret had laughed, eyes misting, and embraced the name with joy. To Lucas, she was a compass, a mentor, a friend, and, in many ways, the matriarchal figure he'd lost too young. She never tried to take the place of his late wife, never interfered with his parenting, but she was always there when he needed guidance or encouragement. Their bond deepened over time, quietly, naturally. They weren't family by blood, but their connection surpassed labels. One Saturday in late May, as they sat on the porch watching Lily blow bubbles into the wind, Margaret turned to Lucas with a glint in her eye. "I've been thinking," she said. Lucas raised a brow, sipping his lemonade. "Should I be worried? Perhaps," she said with a smile. "I want to start something new, an initiative, a program that offers housing and job support to single parents, not shelters but homes, dignified spaces, and I want you to run it." Lucas blinked. "Meh. Yes. You," she said gently. "Because who better to lead it than someone who's lived it? I'll provide the funding and connections. You'll provide the vision." Lucas was quiet for a long moment. "I never thought I'd be someone who built programs like that. I used to fix mufflers and scrape change for groceries." "You still are that someone," she said. "But now, you're also a builder of hope." He smiled. "Then let's build it." The following months brought a whirlwind of purpose. Lucas poured his soul into the project, which they named the Second Hand Initiative, a nod to the moment when Lucas had reached out and taken Margaret's hand without hesitation. The first pilot location opened in a refurbished building not far from Brook Hill. It offered private apartments, a daycare, job training, and community therapy services. Lucas personally walked each family through the doors, shaking their hands, telling them, "You're not alone anymore." The project gained attention quickly. Media outlets picked it up, not because of flashy press releases or celebrity endorsements, but because of the authentic stories, real people, real healing, and real results. Donations poured in. Volunteers lined up, and through it all Lucas remained humble, keeping his sleeves rolled up and his feet grounded. Lily, now 7 and thriving, would sometimes accompany him to events. She would hold his hand, dressed in little sundresses Margaret had gifted her, and beam proudly whenever someone asked, "Is this your daughter?" "Yes," Lucas would always say. "She's my whole world." And Margaret, she didn't need the spotlight. She attended the events, of course, her reputation as the anonymous benefactor slowly replaced by admiration for her humility. She always stood slightly to the side, letting Lucas shine. When asked how the idea began, she would say, "It started with kindness." One evening, after a successful fundraiser, Lucas walked Margaret to her car. The city skyline behind them was dusted in gold from the setting sun. "You look proud," he said. "I am," she replied. "But not just of the project. Of you." Lucas looked down, humbled. "I still don't know why you chose me." Margaret turned to him, her expression tender. "Because the world passed me by, Lucas. You didn't. You didn't know who I was. And you didn't care. You saw me. And when someone sees you in your most broken state and loves you anyway, That's rare. Lucas swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. You gave me everything. No, she said firmly. You had everything all along. I just helped you see it. They hugged quietly. The silence between them filled with the gratitude words couldn't express. Years passed. The second-hand initiative expanded to multiple cities. Lucas became a name people recognized, not just as the founder, but as a voice for kindness-driven leadership. He was invited to speak at panels, to consult on nonprofit models, to advise on legislation. But he always returned home before dinner, always read to Lily at night, always made time for Sunday tea with Margaret. Margaret's health inevitably began to decline. Gently, gradually, she aged with grace, accepting the slow changes of her body without complaint. Lucas hired a private nurse for her, but she insisted on staying involved in the foundation for as long as she could. On her 84th birthday, the foundation threw a celebration in her honor. Hundreds of people attended, staff, families, public officials, even former program graduates who now had homes, jobs, and children of their own. Margaret stood at the podium, Lucas beside her, and delivered a short speech that quieted the room. When I was lost, she said, her voice soft but clear, no one stopped to help me. Except one man. He didn't ask for my name or my wealth. He offered me his hand. That hand led me back not only to safety, but to purpose. And in helping me find myself, he also found a new path for himself. So if there is one message I leave you with tonight, it is this: never underestimate the power of stopping for someone. It may seem like a small act, but it can change everything. But the applause lasted long after she finished. Lucas looked at her and whispered, "Thank you for giving me the chance." Margaret smiled, her hand resting on his. "No, my dear, thank you for saving my life." When Margaret passed quietly in her sleep 2 years later, the world mourned the loss of a philanthropist, a business pioneer, and a legacy of compassion. Her funeral was small by request, attended by close friends, staff, and of course, Lucas and Lily. She left behind a will that surprised many, donating the vast majority of her fortune to the second-hand initiative and naming Lucas the sole executor of her charitable trust. To Lily, she left her collection of first-edition fairy tale books, the pearl pendant she had always worn, and a letter sealed with wax. Lucas opened it for her the night after the funeral. Together they read, "Dear Lily, I once believed I had seen all the beauty life could offer. Until I met you. Your laughter, your art, your warmth reminded me of magic long forgotten. I leave you these stories because you, my darling, are a story the world is better for knowing. Never stop dreaming. Love always." Gran Maggie, Lily cried, and Lucas held her tight. They sat by the window, looking out at the stars, imagining Margaret among them, watching, smiling content. A year later, Lucas stood before the newest second-hand initiative center, named the Margaret Winslow House of Renewal. As he cut the ribbon, surrounded by families, partners, and friends, he looked out over the crowd and thought back to the rain-soaked morning when he first saw her, shivering, invisible, and lost. He had taken her hand then, not knowing it would lead them here, not knowing that kindness would build an empire of healing, not knowing that, in helping a forgotten woman remember who she was, he would find the version of himself he was always meant to be. And as the applause echoed, and the doors opened to welcome the first residents, Lucas Bennett smiled, knowing that this was not the end. It was only the beginning.